Imagine standing on the edge of your breakthrough, so close you can almost touch it, yet something seems to hold you back. You've been waiting, you've been wondering, and maybe you've been even wrestling with God's timing, asking, "How much longer, Lord?" If that feeling resonates with you, the Book of Deuteronomy may hold the answers you've been seeking. This isn't just a book of laws or ancient history. It's Moses' final call to faithfulness, a reminder that God's promises are near, and a challenge to prepare our hearts to step into the blessings He has in store for us. As Moses stood before a new generation of Israelites, a generation that had not known the wilderness of Egypt, he reminded them of the journey they had walked, of the promises made, and the lessons learned. The words he spoke that day were not only for them, but for us as well. In a world full of distractions, where it can feel like the promises of God are just out of reach, Deuteronomy calls us back to the essentials, remembering God's faithfulness, choosing obedience, and loving Him with all our hearts, souls, and strength. Today, as we dive into the powerful messages of Deuteronomy, we'll uncover the timeless truths that God has for us, just as He had for the Israelites long ago. It's more than just history. It's a guide for living a life anchored in His promises. Let's take this journey together and uncover the treasures that lie within Moses' final words to God's people, a guide for those standing on the brink of their promises, unsure of what lies ahead, but trusting in a faithful God who always keeps His word. As Moses stood before the people of Israel, his heart heavy with the weight of his final words, he knew that this moment would mark the end of an era. The Israelites, who had been wandering in the wilderness for so many years, were now on the brink of entering the land that had been promised to their ancestors. But before they could cross the Jordan River and claim their inheritance, Moses had one last thing to say, his farewell address, which would echo across the generations. Moses was not simply bidding them goodbye. No, this was more than a farewell. It was a reminder of God's faithfulness, of His promises, and of the deep responsibility the Israelites held as the chosen people of God. They had witnessed miracles. God had parted the Red Sea, delivered them from Pharaoh's grasp, provided for them in the wilderness. But Moses knew that their greatest challenge lay ahead, not in the land they were about to enter, but in keeping their hearts true to the God who had brought them this far. Moses' words that day were filled with both caution and hope. He spoke to the new generation that would soon enter the Promised Land, reminding them that they were not to repeat the mistakes of their parents. He spoke of the journey that had brought them to this point, the highs and the lows, the victories and the failures. The wilderness journey was a testament to both God's incredible patience and the Israelites' tendency to forget, to wander, and to stray from the path that had been set before them. "Remember," Moses urged them, "remember what the Lord your God has done for you." It wasn't just about remembering the miracles, it was about remembering the faithfulness of God in the midst of the struggles, in the desert, in the long seasons of waiting. It was a call to stop looking back at Egypt, to stop longing for the comforts of the past, and to step forward into the promises that God had prepared for them. Moses knew that the biggest threat to their future success would not be the giants in the land of Canaan, but their own hearts. The danger was forgetting, becoming complacent, and losing sight of the God who had been with them every step of the way. Moses was not just a leader, he was a witness to God's work in their lives. His life, from the burning bush to the miracles of the Exodus, had been marked by God's intervention and faithfulness. Yet, even Moses himself had moments of failure and doubt. He wasn't perfect. And that's why his final message to the people was so powerful. It wasn't about perfection, but about faithfulness. It wasn't about never stumbling, but about getting up and continuing to walk in the direction of God's promises. Moses, with all his imperfections, was a living testament to the grace of God. His life was a reminder that, no matter how many times we fall short, God's call to faithfulness remains. Now, as Moses prepared to leave them, he urged the people not to let his departure be a moment of despair, but a moment of renewed purpose. He was handing the baton to Joshua, but more than that, he was handing the people back to God. And in doing so, he called them to renew the covenant they had with God, to make a fresh commitment to the Lord who had been with them since the very beginning. The covenant renewal wasn't a simple ritual. It was a solemn and life-changing commitment. Moses was reminding the Israelites that this wasn't just about the rules, the laws, or the rituals. It was about their relationship with God. It was about the love that God had shown them, and how they were to respond in kind. Moses made it clear that the covenant was not something they could take lightly. It was not a mere agreement to follow rules, but a promise to walk in relationship with God. They were to love God with all their hearts, souls, and strength. This call to covenant renewal wasn't just for the Israelites thousands of years ago. It is just as relevant to us today. We too are called to renew our commitment to God, not because He needs our promises, but because we need to remember and reflect on His faithfulness. Every day we are faced with choices about how we will live, how we will prioritize God in our lives, and how we will respond to His love. The Israelites had to choose to follow God's commands and to love Him with all that they were. And that's the challenge we face every day. The renewal of the covenant was also a call to obedience. God had laid out His expectations clearly, but He was not doing so out of obligation. He was doing so out of love. Love for His people, love for us. Moses reminded the people that God had not forgotten them, even when they had faltered. He had been with them through the wilderness, providing for their every need, and now He was offering them the land He had promised their ancestors. But with that gift came the responsibility of keeping the covenant. The choice to obey was not just about following rules. It was about maintaining a relationship with the God who had brought them this far. This renewal was a call to action. It wasn't just about saying words or performing rituals. It was about living them out. It was about ensuring that their hearts were fully aligned with God's will, that their actions reflected His holiness, and that they were preparing the next generation to follow Him. Moses knew that the future of Israel depended not just on their ability to obey the laws, but on their ability to pass down their faith to the generations that would come after them. This is why Moses urged them to teach their children the words of the covenant, to instill the love of God in their hearts, and to ensure that the faith would continue long after Moses was gone. In our own lives, we are faced with the same challenge. How do we ensure that our faith is not just something we talk about, but something we live out? How do we make sure that our hearts are aligned with God's will, that our actions reflect His love, and that we are passing on that love to the next generation? The Israelites were given the responsibility to keep the covenant, but it wasn't just about them. It was about those who would follow. Moses' farewell address and the call for covenant renewal is a reminder for us today to stop looking back at our past failures, to stop longing for the things we've left behind, and to step forward into the promises God has for us. It's a call to be faithful, to love God with all our hearts, and to live in such a way that the next generation will inherit a faith that is vibrant and alive. Just as the Israelites stood on the edge of the promised land, so too do we stand on the brink of new opportunities and blessings. And just as Moses called the Israelites to remember God's faithfulness, so too are we called to remember all that God has done for us and to respond in love and obedience. As Moses continued to speak, his voice carried the weight of years of experience, the knowledge of his own mistakes, and the deep love he had for his people. He knew that obedience was the key to the Israelites' future success, and that without it, they would face the consequences of their disobedience. The story of Israel was a story of faith, but it was also a story of failure. Time and time again, the Israelites had wandered, doubted, and turned away from God. Yet time and time again, God had been faithful, bringing them back to himself. Moses' words were a powerful reminder that obedience to God wasn't just about following rules. It was about maintaining a relationship with the Creator. The laws that God had given them were not arbitrary restrictions, but a blueprint for living in harmony with Him. They were a guide for flourishing, a way for the Israelites to experience His blessings and be a light to the nations around them. But the choice was theirs. Obedience was not forced upon them. It was a response to God's love, an active choice to trust Him, even when it seemed difficult, even when the promises seemed far off. Moses shared with them the importance of living according to God's commandments, reminding them that their obedience would lead to blessings, both spiritual and physical. The land they were about to enter was filled with abundance, a land flowing with milk and honey. But Moses warned, if they turned away from God and followed after other gods, their blessings would turn to curses. The land would no longer yield its bounty, and their enemies would defeat them. These words were not just for the Israelites. They resonate with us today. How often do we find ourselves caught in the tension between trusting God's promises and doubting His timing? How many times do we face the temptation to take matters into our own hands, to seek comfort or success through other means, rather than trusting in God's plan? Just as the Israelites stood on the cusp of their inheritance, so too do we stand at the threshold of God's promises for our lives, whether it's peace, joy, or fulfillment. The question is, will we choose to obey, even when the road ahead seems uncertain? Will we trust in God's faithfulness, even when we don't see immediate results? Moses' farewell address was not just about reminding the Israelites of their past. It was about preparing them for their future. It was a call to obedience, a challenge to trust in God's guidance, and a warning of the dangers of turning away from Him. As Moses spoke, the reality of the choice before the Israelites became clear. They could either choose to follow God's way, walking in His blessings, or they could turn to their own ways and face the consequences. As Moses concluded his address on the importance of obedience, he transitioned to another key part of his message, the renewal of the covenant. This wasn't just a ritual or a formality, it was a deep, personal commitment to God and His will. The covenant wasn't just about obeying laws, it was about a relationship, a bond between God and His people. And as Moses spoke, it was clear that the Israelites had a responsibility not only to uphold their end of the covenant, but to pass it on to the generations that would follow. Moses reminded them of God's deep love and faithfulness. He reminded them that God had chosen them out of all the nations of the earth, not because of their greatness or merit, but because of His grace and love. It was a love that had been demonstrated time and time again, through their deliverance from Egypt, through His provision in the wilderness, and through His promise of a land where they could settle and thrive. But with that love came responsibility to live according to God's will, to walk in His ways, and to remember that they were His people, set apart for His purposes. This renewal of the covenant was not just about individual commitments. It was a communal act. Moses urged the Israelites to teach their children about the covenant, to impress it upon their hearts, and to make it the foundation of their lives. It wasn't just about keeping the commandments. It was about passing down the knowledge of God's faithfulness, of His love, and of His expectations for His people. For us today, this call to covenant renewal is just as relevant. How are we living out our commitment to God? How are we teaching the next generation to love Him, to obey His commands, and to walk in His ways? The challenge of Moses' message is that it's not enough to simply know God's commands. We are called to live them out, to be a witness to His love, and to pass that witness on to others. Our covenant with God is not just a personal one, it is a communal one, meant to be shared and lived out in community with others. As we reflect on Moses' call to obedience and covenant renewal, we are reminded that our relationship with God is not just about what we do, it's about who we are. We are His people, chosen by His grace, and called to live out His purposes in the world. And just as the Israelites were given a land to call their own, we are given the opportunity to live in the abundance of God's promises if we are faithful to His call. In this journey of faith, there will be moments of doubt, moments when we question God's timing or wonder if His promises are still true. But just as Moses reminded the Israelites of God's faithfulness in their past, we are called to remember how He has been faithful to us. And when we do, we are reminded that, just as He was with them in the wilderness, He is with us today, guiding us, providing for us, and calling us to walk in His ways. Moses' farewell address, his call to obedience and covenant renewal, is a message for us today. It challenges us to look at our own hearts and examine our commitment to God. Are we truly walking in obedience to His will? Are we passing down the legacy of faith to the next generation? And most importantly, are we ready to step into the promises God has prepared for us, trusting that He will be faithful to lead us, just as He led the Israelites into the promised land? As we continue on this journey, may we hear Moses' words echo in our hearts, urging us to choose obedience, to renew our covenant with God, and to trust in His faithfulness, both now and in the generations to come. As Moses continued his farewell address, the Israelites stood at the edge of the promised land, and the tension in the air was palpable. They were on the brink of entering a land of abundance, a land flowing with milk and honey. But before they could take possession of it, Moses had one more crucial lesson to impart. His words were not just a reminder of what God had done, they were a powerful declaration of what could happen if they turned away from God's commandments. Moses, having witnessed firsthand the consequences of disobedience, shared the stark realities that awaited the Israelites should they choose to forsake the Lord. He painted a vivid picture of the blessings they would receive if they chose obedience, flourishing crops, victory over enemies, and peace in the land. But he also warned of the devastating consequences of disobedience. If they turned to other gods, if they forsook the covenant, the land would no longer be their blessing. It would become a curse. Famine would ravage the land, enemies would overrun them, and their children would suffer for their choices. It's not hard to see how this warning applies to us today. How often do we face the temptation to put our trust in things other than God? Whether it's in our work, relationships, or personal achievements, there's always a pull toward placing our hope in things that are fleeting and temporary. But just as Moses reminded the Israelites, we too are called to remember that when we choose to put our trust in anything other than God, we risk losing the blessings He has for us. The choice is not just about avoiding the curses, It's about choosing the abundant life that comes from walking in obedience to Him. It's a choice we must make daily. Will we choose the path of obedience, or will we allow the distractions and idols of our world to pull us away from the fullness of God's promises? Moses knew that the danger wasn't just external, it was internal. The Israelites, like all of us, were prone to forgetfulness. They had witnessed the miracles. They had been provided for in miraculous ways, and yet Moses feared that they would forget and turn away. The danger of forgetting was not just a theological issue, it was a practical one. Forgetting God's faithfulness could lead to complacency, and complacency could lead to disaster. And so, Moses called on the Israelites to remember the covenant, to not only follow God's laws, but to live them out with a whole heart. They had to actively choose to live in a way that honored God, even in the midst of abundance and success. This call to remember is not just a lesson for the Israelites, it is one for us today. How often do we forget God's faithfulness in our own lives? How easily do we become distracted by the busyness of life or the allure of success? Just like the Israelites, we are constantly being called to remember, to return to the heart of our covenant with God, and to live according to His ways. This call is not just about avoiding sin. It's about living with a whole heart, fully committed to God, remembering that He is the source of every good thing we have. In the midst of these sobering warnings, Moses also offered hope. He reminded the Israelites that even if they fell, even if they stumbled in their faith, there was always the opportunity for repentance and restoration. God's mercy was not limited to the obedient, but extended to the repentant. Moses knew that the Israelites would face difficulties, that they would fall short, but he also knew that God's grace would never abandon them. He called them to choose life, to choose blessing, and to choose God, knowing that even in their failures, God would be there to restore them. This message of hope is a thread that runs throughout the entire Bible and is echoed in the New Testament as well. We are not saved by our ability to perfectly obey God's commands, but by His grace and His faithfulness. The Israelites were given a choice, life or death, blessing or curse, obedience or rebellion. And while their history was filled with failure, it was also filled with God's mercy and His willingness to restore them when they turned back to Him. This is the story of our lives as well. We face the same choice. Will we choose to live in a way that honors God, trusting in His faithfulness? Or will we allow the distractions and idols of our world to lead us astray? Moses' final words were not just a call to obedience, they were a call to remember. To remember that God's faithfulness had never failed them and would not fail them in the future. To remember the promises He had made and the covenant He had established. And most importantly, to remember that they were God's people, set apart for His purposes. As we reflect on Moses' call to remember, we are reminded of our own need to renew our commitment to God. Just as Moses called the Israelites to pass on the faith to the next generation, we too are called to share the story of God's faithfulness with those who come after us. We are called to live in a way that reflects His love, His mercy, and His justice. And just as Moses led the Israelites to the brink of the promised land, we are called to lead others to the promises God has for them, knowing that His faithfulness will guide us every step of the way. Moses, with great urgency in his voice, reminded the Israelites of the ever-present danger of idolatry. This wasn't a problem confined to the past. It was a temptation they would face when they entered the Promised Land. The Canaanites, the people who lived in the land, worshipped false gods and idols. They had altars and statues dedicated to their gods, and their religious practices were rooted in materialism, lust for power, and violence. Moses warned the Israelites that if they didn't remain vigilant, if they didn't keep their hearts fixed on the one true God, they would be led astray by these idols. Idolatry, Moses warned, was not just the physical act of bowing down to a statue. It was the tendency to place anything above God in our hearts. Anything that competes for our devotion to God can become an idol. Money, success, relationships, and even our own desires can easily take the place of God in our lives if we are not careful. Moses understood the dangers of idolatry because he had seen the consequences firsthand. He had witnessed the golden calf incident, where the people turned to idols when they grew impatient waiting for Moses to return from the mountain. That moment of idolatry had caused a breach in the relationship between God and his people, and it almost led to their destruction. For us today, idolatry may not look like golden calves or stone statues, but it is just as prevalent. The idols we worship may be more subtle, but they still lead us away from God. The desire for wealth, power, or approval can easily consume our hearts and minds, leaving little room for God. Moses' words about idolatry are as relevant today as they were then. The call is clear. We are to put God first, above all else. He is the only one worthy of our worship, and anything that competes with his place in our hearts must be destroyed, just as Moses commanded the Israelites to destroy the altars and idols of the Canaanites. But the good news is that just as God offered the Israelites a way back to him through repentance, he offers the same grace to us. No matter how far we have gone astray, no matter how many times we have placed other things before God, his arms are always open, ready to receive us back. Repentance is the key to restoration, and God's mercy is always greater than our sin. This is the heart of the gospel, the message that even when we fail, even when we turn to idols, God is faithful to forgive and restore us. As we examine our own lives, we must ask ourselves, what are the idols in our hearts? What are the things that take precedence over God? And how can we return to him, choosing to love him with all our heart, soul, and strength? Moses' call to remember, to obey, and to destroy the idols in our lives is just as urgent today as it was when he first spoke it. As Moses continued his final instructions, he turned his focus to something deeply personal, something that every Israelite needed to take to heart, and that each of us must consider in our own lives: the love of God. The Israelites were not simply called to follow rules. They were called to love the Lord with all their hearts, souls, and strength. This wasn't a mere command to be obeyed. It was the foundation of their relationship with God. The covenant was not just about external observances. It was about internal transformation. It was about turning their hearts, their affections, their very beings toward God. Moses knew that without this love at the core of their lives, everything else would fall apart. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might, Moses declared, Deuteronomy 6:5. These words are not just a command, but the very essence of a life lived with God. It's not just about doing the right things, but loving God in such a way that our actions flow from that love. Loving God means placing him first above all other things, allowing him to shape every part of our lives. This love isn't passive. It's active, passionate, and requires everything we have. It's a love that leads to obedience, a love that leads to surrender. But Moses didn't stop there. He understood that love, like faith, requires teaching, nurturing, and sharing. This love for God wasn't meant to be kept to ourselves. It was meant to be passed on. He called the Israelites to teach their children and to remind themselves of God's commandments every day. They were to talk about these commandments when they were at home, when they walked along the road, when they lay down to sleep, and when they rose up in the morning. Deuteronomy 6:7. This was not meant to be a casual or occasional thing. It was meant to be a part of the fabric of their lives. Their love for God was to be woven into the very rhythms of their daily existence. In a world that constantly pulls us in different directions, where distractions and busyness often crowd out what truly matters, Moses' command is a powerful reminder. Our love for God must be the driving force behind everything we do. It's easy to get caught up in the demands of life, to focus on the tasks at hand, to worry about the future, and to lose sight of the one thing that matters most: our relationship with God. But if we are to walk in obedience, if we are to experience the fullness of God's blessings, we must keep our hearts aligned with Him, seeking Him first above all else. This call to love God with everything we have is not just for the Israelites, it's for us as well. Just as Moses challenged the Israelites to love God wholeheartedly, we too must examine our hearts. Are we loving God with all our hearts, souls, and strength? Or have we allowed other loves, other priorities, to take the place of our devotion to Him? Loving God requires a choice. It's a choice we make every day, and it's a choice that will shape the course of our lives. Moses' farewell address and his call to love God with all of our heart, soul, and strength set the stage for something deeper: the passing on of the faith. Moses understood that the covenant was not just about one generation, it was about the generations to come. He was speaking not only to those who stood before him, but to their children, their grandchildren, and every generation that would follow. His call was to ensure that the faith, the love for God, and the knowledge of His laws would be passed down and lived out in every home, in every heart. And this was more than just a passing of information, it was a passing of a way of life. Moses urged the people to impress these commandments upon their children, to talk about them constantly, to make them the foundation of their lives. This was to be a faith that was shared, taught, and lived. It wasn't just about knowing the rules or following the commandments. It was about instilling a love for God that would shape the hearts of future generations. In our own lives, this challenge remains. We are called to pass down our faith, not just by teaching doctrine, but by living it out in front of others, especially in front of our children. Faith is not something that can simply be taught. It must be demonstrated. Our children, our families, and those around us will learn not just from what we say, but from what we do. They will see the love of God reflected in our actions, our choices, and our relationships. And it is through this example that the next generation will come to know and love God for themselves. This is not a passive task. Just as Moses urged the Israelites to be intentional in teaching their children about God, we too must be intentional in passing on our faith. We must make time to teach, to model, and to guide the next generation in walking with God. In a world that is increasingly distracted, it is more important than ever that we invest in the spiritual growth of those around us. The faith we pass down today will shape the future. Moses' words to the Israelites resonate just as strongly for us today. While we are not facing the same challenges that the Israelites did, the call to obedience, love, and covenant renewal remains just as relevant. Just as Moses called the Israelites to remember God's faithfulness, to live according to His commandments, and to pass that faith on to the next generation, we are called to do the same. In today's world, it can feel like the promises of God are far off, or that they are out of reach. We face a society that values self-sufficiency and independence. where personal achievement is often prioritized over faith and community. But the message of Deuteronomy is clear. We cannot do this alone. We need God. We need His guidance, His commandments, and His love. And just as Moses called the Israelites to choose life and to walk in obedience, we are called to do the same. Living out the covenant today means choosing to make God the center of our lives. It means living with a wholehearted love for Him and allowing that love to shape everything we do. It means passing on our faith to the next generation, not just through words, but through our actions. And it means walking in obedience, even when the world around us seems to pull us in a different direction. The Israelites were called to a life of faithfulness, not just for themselves, but for the generations to come. And we too are called to live a life of faithfulness, knowing that our actions today will have an impact on those who come after us. Just as Moses passed the baton to Joshua, and the Israelites passed the faith to their children, we must pass on the faith to those who will carry it forward in the future. As we move forward in our lives, let us remember the words of Moses. Choose life, choose obedience, choose to love God with all your heart, soul, and strength. Let these words guide us as we seek to live out the covenant today, to walk in His ways, and to pass that love on to the next generation. The challenge is before us. Will we walk in obedience, remembering God's faithfulness, and passing on our faith to those who will come after us? Will we, like the Israelites, choose life and walk in the blessings of God's promises? The choice is ours, and just as God was faithful to the Israelites, He will be faithful to us as we walk in His ways. As I sit here reflecting on all we've shared today, I can't help but feel a deep sense of awe at the profound wisdom and relevance of Moses' words to the Israelites. It's amazing how a story that took place thousands of years ago continues to speak into our lives, inviting us to live with purpose, to love God with all our heart, and to walk in obedience to His calling. And it makes me wonder, how often do we stop to think about the promises God has made to us? And how often do we forget to pause and reflect on His faithfulness? Maybe, just maybe, that's the reason we struggle to experience the fullness of His blessings. Maybe it's because we forget to remember. Can you imagine for a moment being one of the Israelites standing on the edge of the promised land, hearing Moses' voice echo in the air, urging you to choose life, to choose obedience, and to love God with all that you are? It's such a powerful picture, isn't it? They were about to step into a land of abundance, a land full of promises. But Moses knew that their success didn't depend on the land they were about to enter. It depended on their hearts. And I think that's something we can all relate to today. The journey ahead of us may not always be easy, and the road may sometimes seem uncertain. But what remains constant is God's call to love Him, to trust Him, and to walk with Him. I know life can be overwhelming. It's easy to get caught up in the busyness, the noise, the distractions that demand our attention. It's easy to look at the chaos around us and wonder if we'll ever find peace. But Moses' message to the Israelites wasn't just about avoiding the distractions. It was about staying true to what mattered most. It was about keeping our hearts centered on God, remembering His faithfulness, and trusting in His promises. And as I think about our own lives, I believe this is the key to unlocking the peace, joy, and fulfillment that we all long for. So, how do we apply this to our lives? It starts with remembering. Just as Moses told the Israelites to remember God's faithfulness, we too must take time to reflect on His goodness in our own lives. We all have stories of God's provision, His guidance, and His love. And when we choose to remember, When we choose to reflect on all that He's done, it becomes easier to trust Him with the future. The future is uncertain, and there will always be challenges that we don't expect. But when we've seen God move in the past, we can step forward in faith, knowing He will continue to lead us. But remember, remembering isn't just about looking back. It's about moving forward with renewed strength and purpose. Just as Moses called the Israelites to obey God's commands, we too are called to live out our faith in a tangible way. It's not enough to simply believe in God. We must live as though we believe, allowing His love to shape the way we interact with the world, the way we serve others, and the way we make decisions. The Israelites were not just called to follow rules, they were called to live out their covenant with God, to be a light to the nations around them. And we too are called to shine brightly in a world that desperately needs to see the love of Christ. It's not always easy, is it? The world we live in is full of distractions, and it can be difficult to keep our focus on what truly matters. But here's the thing, we don't have to do it alone. Just as God was with the Israelites in the wilderness, He is with us today. His presence is constant, His love never fails, and His faithfulness endures forever. And as we walk through the ups and downs of life, we can rest assured that we are not walking alone. God is with us every step of the way, guiding us, strengthening us, and reminding us of His promises. But it's not just about us, is it? Just as Moses urged the Israelites to pass on their faith to the next generation, we too have a responsibility to share the love of God with those around us. Our faith is not meant to be kept to ourselves. It's meant to be shared, passed on, and lived out for the world to see. Whether it's through our families, our communities, or our workplaces, we have the opportunity to be a witness to God's love. And just as Moses told the Israelites to teach their children, we are called to teach the next generation about God's faithfulness, His love, and His truth. It's not just about what we say, it's about how we live. The next generation is watching us, learning from us, and looking to us for guidance. Let's make sure we're setting an example worth following. As we bring this all together, I want to challenge you today. What will you do with the message of Deuteronomy? Will you choose to remember God's faithfulness in your life? Will you choose to live in obedience, trusting that He knows what's best for you? Will you make the decision to love God with all your heart, soul, and strength, and allow that love to shape everything you do? The choice is yours, and just as Moses called the Israelites to choose life, God is calling us to do the same. The journey ahead of us may be uncertain, but one thing is for sure. God's love is constant, His promises are true, and His faithfulness never fails. So, if this message has resonated with you today, I want to invite you to take action. If you haven't already, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, because I want to continue sharing these powerful messages with you. Together, let's choose to remember, to love, and to walk in obedience, trusting that God will guide us every step of the way. And if this message has inspired you, I encourage you to share it with someone who needs to hear it. Let's pass this truth on to others and make sure the next generation knows the love of God. Thank you for joining me today. I pray that you feel encouraged, challenged, and ready to step forward in faith. You are not alone in this journey. God is with you, and His love will always lead you. Until next time, keep walking in His light and trusting in His promises. God bless you.